We will start almost on time because we know we are all pressure for time today, including the illustrious guest speaker that we have here. Thank you everyone for being here. Today's talk by our president marks the closing of this year-long commemoration of the World War I centennial. My name is Andrea Ciccarelli, and as the coordinator of the centennial, I've had the pleasure and the honor to introduce many illustrious guest speakers throughout the year. But naturally, I'm utterly delighted to introduce to you a speaker that really needs no presentation, President Michael McRobbie. I would like to state right away that President McRobbie is, by all means, a true guest speaker of this series, as his presence here today is due to my persistent invitation, and persistent here is a synonym of pestering, maybe. Despite his initial resistance, because in his own words, he is not an historian, and perhaps I may add, because he's relatively busy in these days, I'm delighted that he could close this year-long event. But not just so simply because he's our president, but because of his deep knowledge and understanding of a discipline, history, and a subject, World War I, that he knows and masters like few others, outside of the history department of Indiana University, obviously, which is world rank, and we know that. There is also another reason for which his presence here today is perfectly appropriate, and it has to do with the fact that President McRobbie, together with Provost Lauren Robel, has been the true force behind this entire commemoration, supporting and fostering a multidisciplinary approach that integrated the arts and humanities with social, international, and political sciences. This multifaceted approach, which is what I believe distinguishes our commemoration from other institutions, has also focused on our residential campus permanent jewels. And we have had splendid exhibition at the Art Museum, the Lilly Library, the Wells Library, the Mothers Museum, a film series in the IU Cinema, as well as a memorable performance of Benjamin Britten's War Requiem at the Jacob School of Music last November. It is not strange at all, therefore, that President McRobbie is the closing speaker of this exploration of different aspects and topics related to World War I on our campus. Michael McRobbie is the 18th president of Indiana University, and he joined Indiana University, hired directly by the then late President Brand, to serve as vice president for information technology and chief information officer in 1997. He later became vice president for research in 2003, and interim provost and vice president for academic affairs for Indiana University Bloomington in 2006, before being appointed in his current position in 2007. Dr. McRobbie earned his PhD at the Australian National University and holds many honorary doctorates from the University of Queensland, Sung Kyun Kwan University in Korea, the Australian National University, the Southeastern European University, and Griffith University. So he's a multiple doctor, so we speak about multifaceted aspects of World War I. He sits on national and international boards and is a member of the National Security Higher Education Advisory Board and a member and former chair of University Research Associates, which is responsible for Fermi Lab. President McRobbie, who holds faculty appointments in computer science, philosophy, cognitive science, informatics, library and information science, and computer technology, has been an active researcher in information technology and logic over his career, receiving several major grants and publishing numerous books and articles on these topics. Amongst his many honors and awards, I would like to mention a few. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is an honorary fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities. In 2007, he was made a Sagamore of the Wabash, the highest honor that the state of Indiana can bestow on a private individual. In 2010, he was made an officer of the Order of Australia by Australia's National Honor System, which of course makes me wonder whether or not impose that we might have made a mistake all this year. Maybe we should call him Sir Michael and not President McRobbie. But it's Australia, not England, so. President McRobbie received the Anti-Defamation League's Man of Achievement Award, of course, an extremely prestigious award that really crowns his involvement within and outside of the academic world. Today, on the eve of the anniversary of the Gallipoli disembarkment, In fact, I think in Australia it's already midnight of the next day. So he will is actually the actual day. He will speak to us about the Australian intervention in World War One. Please join me in welcoming Michael McRobbie to not Indiana University, but to the podium.
Well, thank you very much, Andrea. I think, as Andrea alluded, this is one of those situations where it seemed like a really good idea at the time. Whatever it was 10 months ago when Andrea suggested to me that it might be good for me to do this. Actually, it came after the provost and I both persuaded him to take on the job of being the coordinator for the World War I centennial year, and I guess it can be regarded as appropriate revenge that he did this to me. Let's get that out of the way because I'm going to need the tracker, I think. I also want to start with the same apologia that Andrea already entered for me, and that is that I'm just a humble computer scientist. I'm not a historian. So the historians in the audience, I dare say, may be horrified at various points during this, but I just beg your indulgence as a mere enthusiastic amateur. I do want to also congratulate Andrea on a really fabulous year of events. I think the quality of speakers we've had, the other kinds of events have really shown the full diversity of the capabilities of Indiana University and this campus in particular, and they've been of enormously high quality. And to me, it really is a quintessential example of how a university can teach through multiple methods of bringing some particular part of history or some particular concept really to life. And he's done it marvelously well. I remember when he and I and the provost were talking about this, that we were mindful of the fact that the centennial of the start of World War I was coming up, and really I think there are ways in which you can look at World War I as having an even profounder impact than that of the Second World War. In some ways, I think the World War I was really the boundary line between the old world and the new. Four great empires collapsed: the Hohenzollerns, the Habsburg Empire, the Romanovs, and of course the Ottoman Empire, all of which had been in existence for many hundreds of years. In the case of the Habsburgs, a good 1,000 years before that, and their collapse led to consequences which endure to this day. Of course, the collapse of the Hohenzollerns led pretty much to World War II. In fact, the German generals in the First World War talked about the First World War being the First Punic War, and the Second World War they knew was probably going to come, and that would be the Second Punic War. And I think as Hugh Straw, when he spoke the other night, said it wasn't quite clear whether they saw themselves as the Romans or the Carthaginians in that particular historical comparison. And of course it led to World War II and all the consequences of horrendous consequences of that. The collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire led, among other things, to the enormous instability in the Balkans, which endure to this day, although somewhat muted. These days, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire led, in particular, through the completely arbitrary division of the various previous components of the empire into the kinds of problems that we see enduring in the Middle East today. And the collapse of the Romanovs led to communism and the nightmare of 70 years of that particular ideology, and of course to the Cold War and so on and so on. So all of that really came out of the First World War. It saw the almost bankrupting and severe strain on the British Empire, which until that time was probably largest and greatest empire the world had ever seen, and of course it led to the rise and ascendancy of the United States. And probably when you look at the Second World War, it really didn't have consequences quite as massive and marked as those. Well, but of course my topic today is to talk about Australia in the First World War. And I chose today because today in Australia, I forgot to check to see exactly what time it is in Australia at the moment, but it's Saturday the 25th in Australia, and the 25th of April is in Australia known as Anzac Day, and it will be tomorrow in the United States. In fact, we're having a number of celebrations that Laurie and I will be going to as part of that. And Anzac Day, the 25th of April, represents is the day, the anniversary of the day on which Australian and New Zealand and British troops landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula, and I'll come to that in a little more detail in a minute. This day, Anzac Day in Australia, is without doubt the major and most significant commemoration. I wouldn't even want to call it a holiday, though it is a holiday, in Australia. It is marked, and has certainly been marked since I was a young boy, with great solemnity, at least in the earlier part of the day. It's the day always starts with the dawn service, which is actually held at dawn to mark the point at which the Australian and other troops went ashore, and it is marked with a variety of other activities that I think really recall not just the losses and the horrors of the Gallipoli campaign, but all the horrors and losses that Australia suffered, as it is an Australian holiday, in the First World War. And I'll come to those in just a little bit more to give you a sense of it too, and why it means so much. Occasionally I'm asked, do you celebrate July the 4th in Australia? And I said, well, no, not really. It's an American holiday. And Australia wasn't even settled by Europeans in 1776. It was in fact settled in 1788. The closest thing, and even then it's really not the same kind of thing at all, of a sort of formal national character is what's called Australia Day on 26th of January, which commemorates the beginning of European settlement in Australia. Happened to be, ironically, the day on which I left Australia to move to America. And it's just a holiday of a typically raucous Australian kind. Australia actually has a celebration to commemorate the Federation of Australia, and that's on the 1st of January, because Australia became a federation. That is, it was formed as a nation on the 1st of January 1901. It was a federation of 6 states in Australia. It was, of course, still part of the what was then the British Empire as well, and very much thought of itself as being British. Every aspect of the country really just thought of itself as being a transported part of Britain. So that did not represent the kind of decisive break that July the 4th, of course, represented in this country. But although Anzac Day is not the same kind of thing, Anzac Day does represent, I think in the view of many Australians, the real dawning of Australia, or the consciousness of Australia among Australians as a sort of independent country, even though it is still a member of the British Commonwealth and the Queen remains as the monarch, but that is purely in a constitutional sense. But it's more than that. I think most people associate Anzac Day just with the Gallipoli campaign. The casualties in the Gallipoli campaign were a relatively small fraction of the total casualties that Australia suffered in the First World War, and I'll touch on those as I go through this. Of course, I've got vastly too many slides, but I will slip through some of them quickly to show you the various slides to illustrate various parts of this. I think that my point about how up until around the time of Anzac Day, and certainly the First World War, Australians really thought about themselves as being British. Even when I was a young man in the 50s, I can remember people of my grandparents' generations talking about Britain as home. and that certainly was how people thought about it leading up to the First World War. Well, let me just go through. Let me see. I want to say just very quickly, just a couple of things about Australia, just to give you a sense of context. It's a big country. It's a very big country. Now, 90% of it is kind of unusable because it's desert and so on. But and this is Australia compared to the US. So it's interestingly, it's about the same size as the US. At the time of the outbreak of World War I, there were 5 million people in Australia. So in that giant continent, there were 5 million people. And in the United States at the same time, there were 100 million people, just on 100 million people in the US. So it gives you a scale of the country, and then that'll help give you a sense of what was involved at the outbreak of the war. Now, I said this is a very instructive poster because I said before that Australians at that time thought of themselves as being Brits by and large. There wasn't a huge immigrant population as there was post-Second World War in particular. Australia is now a vastly multicultural country. But you look at this, all answer the call, help the young lions all help the old lion defy his foes. And that's kind of how the colonies, weren't colonies, but the various countries who were part of the Commonwealth of the Empire at that point thought of themselves really the young cubs of the big lion. That pervaded everything, and it's why, incidentally, it's why there was such a massive reaction against the present Prime Minister of Australia bringing back knighthoods and awarding one to Prince Philip. That probably damaged him almost beyond repair politically. Key dates of the First World War, I think everybody knows. June the 28th, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. The Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia, July 28. Germany declares war on Russia, August 1. August 3, Germany declares war on France and rolls in via the von Schlieffen Plan, which of course meant they rolled through Belgium. Britain had guaranteed Belgian neutrality, gave them an ultimatum. They ignored it, so Britain declares war on Germany August the 4th, and a sort of whole cascade of other declarations followed, I think, with Turkey coming in, or the Ottomans coming in October from memory. October the 5th, the then Australian Prime Minister, Cook, said, quote, "When the Empire is at war, so also is Australia." A month later, there was a change of government, and then the Labor, roughly the equivalent of the Democrats in Australia, the Labor Prime Minister then, Andrew Fisher, said, quote, "Should the worst happen, Australia would rally to the mother country to help and defend her to our last man and our last shilling." So that was the sense at the time. Well, so Australia immediately was requested by Britain to provide troops, and immediately raised a force of 20,000 men. And this was combined with a force raised in New Zealand, which had about a quarter of the population of Australia, so a very small country. And the two put together became, at the point, the Australia, New Zealand Army Corps, ANZAC. That's where ANZAC comes from. There were three major theatres during the First World War. There was the Gallipoli Theatre, about which I'll talk. There was the Middle East, and there was the Western Front in Europe. Some of you, I think, probably know something about Gallipoli. I doubt if any of you know anything about what Australia's involvement was in the Middle East or in the Western Front, yet the great bulk of the casualties came in those later two places. I think I've already given you a sense of the size of Australia, 5 million people. Just to summarise it now, and I'll touch on all this stuff during the talk, the Australian Army remained during the whole of the First World War a purely volunteer army, and the government attempted twice in October of 1916 and December of 1917 to introduce what in Australia is called conscription, what here is called the draft, because there was a law that did not allow Australian conscripts, draftees, to serve overseas, and the Prime Minister of the time was able to get would have been able to change that in Parliament, but he couldn't get it through the Senate. It sort of sounded familiar, and so he took it to a referendum. Was twice beaten in a referendum. So the Australian Army remained a volunteer army for the whole of the First World War. One of only two countries, Australia and South Africa, that had purely volunteer forces. Just to give you a sense, and I'll come to this now, then you'll get a sense of how all this happened. Just over 400,000 Australians volunteered. That's out of 5 million people, so it was a lot of volunteers. About 330,000 served overseas. There were 215,000 casualties and 61,500 killed. So the casualty rate was 65% of the men who served overseas, one of the highest casualty rates among the Allies. And another 60,000 died in the 10 years following the First World War from the effects of trauma and gassing and injuries and so on as well. And even when I was young, one could still see thousands of old soldiers in the First World War still alive and horribly injured in many ways, as is the case in all wars. There's nothing that unique about it. But it's also worth commenting that more Australians were killed in the First World War than Americans were killed in the First World War. So it kind of puts in perspective, a country of 5 million versus 100 million, the impact it has. And that captures in numbers why Anzac Day, since it commemorated Australia's first intervention in a major war. Up until then it had done nothing basically in any major conflicts. But that captures why Anzac Day is of such enormous significance, because of the sort of horrendous slaughter that the Australian Army endured in the First World War. So troops were shipped to Gallipoli, and I put this up too because this is because is that showing up, that the arrow? Yeah, good. Because this is how one got from Australia to Europe. In 1954, as a very young boy, my parents travelled to Europe. In those days, you didn't go by plane; you went by sea, and this is exactly the route that we took. The troops went around here. There's a massive port or anchorage here in a place called King George Sound, in the town of Albany, that otherwise is completely isolated, but is very handy in wartime. And I've got a wonderful painting of that to come out in a minute. And then the troops went across here to what was then Ceylon, and across. Amazingly, they would stop at Aden. I remember stopping at Aden when I was very young. Not a place you want to stop now. And but all these places were places that were accessible through the Red Sea and then to Europe. That was the route that they took. This is King George Sound. One of the things you'll see, I've got a lot of paintings in this presentation, which God knows if I'll get through. But the quality of art from the First World War, much of which is in the Australian War Memorial, which I'll again talk about at the end, is just superb. And there's an exhibition of it at the American World War I Museum in Kansas City at the moment. I think about 60 paintings from the Australian collection are there at the moment. In fact, we just had the director here. I was unfortunately preoccupied with RIFRA that week, but we had the director here, didn't we? And who's an Australian, and he talked about various things, but he may have alluded to this collection as well. So that was King George Sound, and this is the first convoy getting ready to embark across the across the Indian Ocean. Interestingly, just very briefly, the one and only significant Australian naval action took place near the Cocos-Keeling Islands, which are around here somewhere, where the Australian cruiser, the Sydney, sunk disabled the German cruiser, the Emden, which was grounded on the Cocos-Keeling Islands. And later, my grandfather, who I'll talk about in a minute, who served in the First World War, when he was shipped out in 1917, late 1917, they sailed right past the Cocos-Keeling Islands. You could see the wreck of the Emden on the island there as they went through there. So that's how the Australian troops got to the Middle East. Originally, they went simply to Egypt to protect the Suez Canal against the Ottomans, who were very sensibly trying to take it. And it was during that period that the British, this is Gallipoli, it was during that period that the British War Cabinet, especially with Churchill's enthusiastic support, came up with the idea of basically storming the Dardanelles, which of course is there, and that would then put what was then called Constantinople at the mercy of the guns of the British and French fleets, hopefully knocking Turkey out of the war, or the Ottomans out of the war, and then opening up the direct supply line to Russia. That was the tactic. I'm one of a minority of Australians who thinks that was quite brilliant, had it been possible to bring it off as a military tactic. Most people can't see beyond the horrors of what happened in Gallipoli to realise that had it been possible to bring it off, it could have had a profound effect on the war. It would have probably knocked the Ottomans out. It would have ensured the Russians were much more substantially supplied, including with troops, which they really couldn't get to them any other way. So that was the idea. And the British and the French navies tried to storm the Straits, but through, I think, probably incompetency to a large extent by the naval commanders, were not able to do it. Then they hit upon the brilliant idea of taking, I'm being somewhat sarcastic, of taking this peninsula, the Gallipoli Peninsula, which, if you look at the topography of it, is incredibly mountainous. And this was to be taken by armed forces who had zero experience in any kind of combined forces landings of the kind that they were going to need to carry out. The first landing was made by the Anzac forces, Australian, New Zealand forces and British forces in what's called Anzac Cove. They were actually meant to have landed further south because this was flatter land, and the goal was to get across, take the peninsula, and then destroy the guns that were stopping the fleet from getting through the Dardanelles. That was basically the idea. But it was extremely mountainous territory. The Ottoman troops turned out to be a very redoubtable foe, first-rate troops. It happened to be that the Turkish troops had a general of genius who happened to be the corps commander, and that was the man who went on to become Ataturk, who really organised the Turkish defence. So the Australians and New Zealanders were stuck on the shore, and inch by inch made their way inland, also subjected to heavy counterattack on numerous times, and suffered horrific losses. There was, at the same time, there was a further landing by the Brits on the end of the Gallipoli Peninsula, and then later on, some months later, there was a further large-scale landing by the Brits to try and force the issue up at Suvla Bay. They were basically the main landings that took place. I decided that I would get completely carried away if I put up a more detailed map and explained to you all the various battles that took place, because they're all etched in an Australian's mind. Places all over Australia are named after a lot of these battles there. But those of you who saw Peter Weir's magnificent movie Gallipoli a few months ago that John Vickers brought will get some sense of the topography. It is amazingly accurate. Here's the troop ships. Here's an actual shot of the landings. In the Australian War Memorial, they have one of these boats that still existed. But look at the mountains there, and these are defended, and people are meant to try and attack those. Here's the landing. There's a battle cruiser out to sea there shelling the ground. That's the landing itself. Men trying to fight their way up. This is a painting, another magnificent painting from the Australian War Memorial, done by one of the war artists. Photography was in its infancy, but they had lots of artists around, so their job was to paint these battle scenes. And then that's Anzac Cove itself. I mean, just a remarkable representation. And there are, of course, photos. And what's interesting, again, for those of you who saw Gallipoli, the movie, was just how accurate the the reconstruction of the landing was with respect to that painting and other photos that Peter Weir did. I think quite a superb movie from that point of view. But basically, all of the I know you can't see what I'm doing. All the Anzac troops were basically pinned down here under constant shell fire and rifle fire and machine gun fire the whole 8 months they were there. So and I've got some. I'll just whip through these. That was what it was like in the hills. That's what it was like on the reverse of the hill. That's where the men lived, basically, because there was some protection from the shell fire there. There's Australian troops going into battle. There's troops. There's quite a famous shot. This one getting ready to go into battle to storm the trenches, and that's an interesting shot from the other point of view. That's Turkish troops going into. Ottoman troops going into battle as well. Again, there are dozens of horrific battles. The one that is depicted in Gallipoli was a charge by one of 6 companies that made up the battalion of the Australian Demounted Australian Light Horse, who the first company of which charged the Turkish machine guns, all were killed, and then the second, third, and fourth companies all charged after that, in spite of what they'd seen happen before them. Just unbelievable how people could do that. So in Gallipoli, there were, by the time the battle finished, there were 2 full Australian divisions that landed with some other units as well. Then eventually, realizing that simply this was an impossible task, they carried out what was what was the only great tactical victory of the whole war, and that was the retreat. When all the forces on the Gallipoli Peninsula evacuated with all kinds of clever manoeuvres and things like that without a single casualty. Really quite remarkable too, so at least it ended well in that sense. But it is, as I said, this is very important for Australia. There were about 9,000 Australians killed in Gallipoli, but Australia didn't lose as many as the Brits, who lost 34,000. So it kind of puts it in perspective too, that though it's enormously important to Australia, you have to also realise the impact in other countries. France had 10,000 casualties. New Zealand 3,000, and the British Indian troops, there were quite a few of them there as well, lost about 1,000, somewhere over 1,000. Anyway, so the withdrawal was complete. The troops went back to the Middle East, but then were withdrawn. All the infantry went to France, landed at Marseille, and then went straight up to the Western Front. I'm just going to concentrate here now on the. So I've got a few more. That's a scene after a battle among the dead. More Australian troops, the wounded coming down off the hills. But I now get to the Middle East. The Middle East was a major engagement for the Australian Army. There were 2 divisions of Australian cavalry together with another 2 divisions of British and other cavalry, made up about a very strong corps. I've read that it was the largest single number of mounted troops under arms ever in the history of warfare. I'd like to see if that's true compared to the Mongols, but it may well be true. Under an Australian commander, a man called Henry Chauvel, who led the what was called the Desert the Desert Mounted Corps, the Desert Mounted Corps for the whole of the Middle Eastern campaign. The first phase in 1916 was the Ottoman attempts to take the Suez Canal, which got very close, repelled, and then slowly Allied strength built up, and the Ottomans were pushed back to the border of Palestine. This is really a remarkable military campaign, and the skill of both sides and the tenacity of both sides is quite remarkable. But there was after having been stalled, really almost on the Western Front type situation, being stalled around Gaza. There were two battles for Gaza, both of which the Turks won, or at least they didn't succeed in breaking the lines. There was, make sure I get the date right. There was, as quite often as decisive in war, there was a change of command, and one of the truly great British generals of the Second World War was put in charge of the whole Middle Eastern front, a man called Allenby, who later became, Edmund Allenby, later became a field marshal. And Allenby really was the kind of man for the situation. He had a really visceral sense of desert warfare and so on. Reorganised the whole army, and then basically used the Australian Mounted Corps to storm Beersheba after all the attacks had been over in Gaza, outflanked Gaza, and then within a few weeks took Jerusalem, and it was the Australian Corps that took Jerusalem. And there's a great shot here. This is the Australian troops beside the Sphinx getting ready to embark for that campaign. And this is the storming of Beersheba. That was probably the decisive turning point in the campaign in the Middle East. This is Henry Chauvel. Henry Chauvel, the general in charge of the whole Mounted Corps. And this is a very important photo. This is Allenby, and he's entering Jerusalem. He deliberately entered Jerusalem on foot because he wanted to show respect for the city that was of enormous significance to the three great monotheistic religions. So that was very well received by all in Jerusalem, that he showed that level of respect. But then, just going back to the map, but then basically after taking Jerusalem, there were a series of major battles, culminating the Battle of Megiddo, it's called, which then led to the taking of Damascus. Again, it was the Australian Corps that took it, and eventually the Ottomans signed an armistice after Aleppo was taken as well. So that was a very brief overview of the Australian campaign in the Middle East. But there were about another 8,000 casualties. There are more Australians buried in the Middle East than there are members of the Israeli Defence Forces. So again, it kind of put it in perspective, the level of casualties. So I get to the most horrific of all, and I do what I know I'm going to probably go over time a bit. Oh, I show you this just because there were very few colour photos in World War I. This is one, and it is of an Australian flying unit that supported the irregular Arab troops that were under the command of King Faisal and Lawrence of Arabia, that formed the right flank of Allenby's forces. The Western Front, well, the butchery, of course, on the Western Front was really defied description. The famous place is Verdun, just the appalling slaughterhouse where the Germans and French each had about 500,000 killed over a period of about a year, 1916. The Somme, where the British had 60,000 casualties in the first day, and where again it was in the hundreds of thousands by the end of I think about 3 months after the Somme started, with almost no gain, and so on. Australian troops were sent there by this stage, or over this period. The size of the Australian contingent had increased to 5 divisions, and they fought under a British general called Birdwood. And they were, let's see if I get you a better map here, they were, there's not a very good map, basically signed up here in a quiet centre of the front for a period, but then they participated in the beginning of the Battle of the Somme, and people are probably familiar with the Battle of the Somme, started on the 1st of July. And there's a place called Fromelles, again a very famous place to Australians, where just to give you a sense of the size of military units, a division in the British scale of units is about 10,000 men. Brigade about 3,000, battalion about 6,000. It's different to the American Army, but that's how the Brits work in Australia, use the British system. So the Australian 5th Division attacked at Fromelles, which is right in the north of the Somme, and they had 5,000 casualties in 24 hours. So half the division was either killed or wounded in that battle. It is to this day, obviously there's been nothing like it since, it is the most costly day in Australian military history. It was the most costly day in Australian military history. It was followed, and that was the Australian 5th Division, it was followed a few days later by the Australian attacks at part of the Somme called Pozières, which is just south of that. I know there isn't a very good map. 3 Australian divisions attacked in sequence, and they cycled through again in sequence over 42 days. Pozières was known as hell, and they suffered 23,000 casualties over that period, 7,000 in 12 days for the Australian 2nd Division. So it was kind of slaughter on an epic scale, but of course it took place all the way through the Western Front, and it took place on both sides. That was where the Australians were billeted, or where they were assigned to start with, and then most of those battles. I'm giving you just a kind of a 100,000-foot sketch. Many of the battles took place in that area there, sort of north of the Somme. There's Australian troops ready to go. This is interesting because you can hardly see it, but there's a top hat in there that belongs to the then Australian Prime Minister, who was watching the Australian troops marching in a battle. There they are again. This is interesting. It's Australian troops and artillery. My grandfather served in the First World War. Just about every Australian of my generation would have had both of his or her grandparents would have served in the First World War. It so happened that my father's Scottish, and my father's father, my grandfather on my father's side, served in the Royal Scots Fusiliers, and he was a sergeant there. He fought right through, including the battles at Ypres. He was in the 1st Battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers. The 6th Battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers was the one that Winston Churchill commanded for the period that he was in. He was in the Western Front. He was there for about 6 months, and he commanded that. My grandfather on my father's side was a sergeant, and he recounted that one of the most awful jobs he had was when an attack came and the men went over the trenches. He had the job of finding any young men who may not have gone over the top, and basically encouraging them to go. If they wouldn't charge, he had to call for a young officer. The young officers, young lieutenants, would be maybe 20, younger than my son, and they would then, if the person was not prepared to charge, they would shoot him. And then they themselves, the sergeants and the officers, would have to go over the top as well. So that was the kind of thing my grandfather did on my father's side, as well as all the rest of the fighting. And my grandfather on my mother's side was in artillery, and his job was he was actually in smaller artillery units than this. Oops, I'm going backwards, sorry. These are troops before battle. Just shows dead after a battle. Australian troops bearing one of their mates. Australian troops, very quintessential Australian faces there in some ways. Before or after battle, actually, and these are shots at those. I mentioned Fromelles. I mentioned Pozières. I mean, these are shots from those areas there. So then the winter came, 1916-17 winter. It was one of the worst winters in recorded history, and Australian troops had to defend parts of the line. And there's a lot of paintings in the Australian War Memorial of the winter, that particular winter here, and these are just a couple of very fine paintings of that period. And then 1917 came, arguably the worst year of all. One of the things that happened in 1917 was the Germans withdrew to the Hindenburg Line, which was pre-prepared defences, which shortened their line and were, all but impregnable. They were followed by the Allies, and the Australians tried to storm the Hindenburg Line at a place called Bullecourt in May of 1917. 3 Australian divisions, along with others, did that and suffered 10,000 casualties over that period there. So you can sort of see how it really, the scale of this is something that's kind of indelibly etched on Australians' minds, because nothing like this had happened in Australia before. But then probably in some ways, the worst one of all. This is a band with these are various scenes around Bullecourt. This I wanted to show you because this is the kind of gun that my grandfather was involved with, and you'll see scattered around shell cartridges. This is a photograph from the National War Memorial, but my grandfather's got photographs that show just the whole area around the gun covered in shell casing. And my grandfather, before he died, gave me this, which is one of those shell cases, and which he brought back from the Western Front as a souvenir. So I proudly keep this as a memory of what he did and his friends did as well. This was one of the very first uses of tanks. These are German soldiers actually carrying Allied wounded back. One of those battles there that just gives you a sense of the utter devastation of it, bodies everywhere, etc. And this is the Battle of Polygon Wood. This was in the Third Battle of Ypres. Ypres was one of the real charnel houses of the British side of the front anyway. Ypres was also, the Third Battle of Ypres is also known as Passchendaele, so you probably might have heard of it. There was a series of different battles, Menin Road, Polygon Wood, and a couple of other ones. Australian forces during that sequence of battles that made up Third Ypres suffered 38,000 casualties during that period there, so it was unbelievable. Well, then we get to 1918. Oh, this is Ypres, completely destroyed. Australian troops marching through Ypres. This is, I think, really quite a remarkable photo, the sun shining through and the devastation. This is a German blockhouse. Because Ypres was so wet, because it was in very marshy ground, you couldn't dig trenches, so the Germans built multiple blockhouses that made it kind of a lethal area to try to fight your way through. Australian troops resting among the dead. There's a destroyed blockhouse. And this is I think it was the 3rd Division after they'd been terribly mauled, the survivors parading. But anyway, 1918, the Western Front. The critical thing that happens in the Western Front in March is the Hindenburg, what was called the Ludendorff Offensive, which was after Germany had knocked Russia out. It had released something like 60 German divisions, all came across to the west, and then participated in this massive attack. And this is part of that attack. The goal was, I don't have a better map, I don't think. No. The goal was to actually try and split the British from the French, reach the coast, and hence do what the Germans did to the British in the Second World War, cut them off from the Channel ports. But of course, there wasn't the sort of mobility and so on, and it was really the last throw of the dice for the Germans in some ways. Australians over that period, the 3 months of the Ludendorff Offensive, basically were on the defensive and fought numerous defensive operations, all of which were quite remarkable. And then, as I said, the same thing happened as it happened with the appointment of General Allenby in the Middle East. There was a really important appointment made, and that was of a man called Monash, who was appointed as the commander of the Australian Corps. And Monash is, without doubt, the finest soldier Australia's ever produced. He was an engineer of the kind that we'll be producing here pretty soon. And Monash took over in June of 1918, and Monash was responsible for the battle of planning and executing the Battle of Hamel. The Battle of Hamel was the first battle that really turned the tide on the Western Front. It wasn't a huge battle, but it was a smaller battle. But it was significant because the first time American troops went into battle, and they went into battle as part of Monash's forces. And Pershing had, so originally there'd been a significant number of American troops because the whole point was America just entered the war, their troops had no experience, so they were being sort of allocated for training with British and Australian and other troops, Canadian troops, of course, who've got a similar story to the one I'm telling here. They were they were sort of inexperienced, but of course they were very enthusiastic. And Pershing, of course, wanted American troops to fight purely under American commanders. And just before the Battle of Hamel, withdrew most of them from the Australian Corps, but not all of them. And so some actually fought with the forces. Monash planned the Battle of Hamel to take 90 minutes. It took 93 minutes. It was one of the most decisive short battles in the whole history of the Western Front. It was the first time that combined arms had been used. I think I've got a photo come out so I can find it. It was one of the first time combined arms had been used. That is, they used tanks and infantry and artillery and planes all together, and it was a smashing success. That really played a major role in the preparation of the Allied counteroffensive, and the Allied counteroffensive was the beginning of the end for the German forces. It was the attack took place on the 8th of August, which is famously known. Erich Ludendorff, the German quartermaster general, referred to it as the Black Day of the German Army, when basically the first time ever the German troops kind of broke before the Allied offensive, and that was the beginning of the 100 Days. And the 100 Days was the unrelenting attack by the Allies, in which the Australian, Canadian, and New Zealand troops were used in the first phases as shock troops, because they just were in better shape than the Brits were, who'd had 2 more years of war to grind them down. And it was what eventually the 100 Days offensive was what ended the war. There's a couple of things I want to tell you about the 100 Days. Firstly, my grandfather arrived in, if I can find the right piece of paper here, my grandfather arrived right at just the month before the beginning of the 100 Days, and he fought in the whole 100 Days offensive. And I've been reading his diary of that period. And this, I'm just going to read you one entry, and this day after day, the entries are like this. He says, "We finished the gun pit at 5:30 a.m. We worked right through the night. Fritz, my apologies to my German friends in the audience, referring to the Germans, shelled using gas and high explosives. At 4:30 a.m., while we were still digging gun pits, all the guns on our side commenced an intense bombardment. Incidentally, our gun pits were the most advanced of all the gun pits in this sector. There was a hop over and a wide front, and we were the right pivot front, which basically means right out the front. The attack was a success. A German plane came over and machine gunned our gunners without result. In the dawn of the morning, the fireworks from the German side looked grand. I mean, obviously, it shows some enthusiasm about these things, and I guess that was what the point that Sir Hugh Strawn was making the other night. And everywhere you looked, you could see our guns spitting out fire. Every entry day after day is like that, and so 100 days of that went on. The 100 Days offensive was the most costly offensive on the Western Front. 1.5 million men were killed in that offensive. 1.5 million casualties in that offensive. There, it involved the storming of the Hindenburg Line, which was done jointly by that stage. American troops had entered in these reasonable numbers, and Monash headed the troops that stormed the Hindenburg Line. He had more American troops under him than he had Australian troops by that stage, which was interesting. And that was the American troops and Australian troops served together. I've got a couple of quotes here that might interest you as well. and this is from a couple of historians. One said, from the outset, the Yanks and the Diggers, the Americans and the Australians, shared a mutual affinity. One American officer noted that Australian soldiers were an independent, alert, energetic lot of men and splendid fighters. From the first, when our soldiers came in contact with them, they mixed well and took kindly to each other. Another said that he felt as much at home among Australians as among his own countrymen. Socially, the Australians enjoyed the company of the Americans who joined them on the Somme in 1918. They sought each other out and were frequently seen together in the rear areas. The Australians saw something of themselves in the American soldiers. And then there's a really wonderful quote from a man called Charles Bean. He was the official Australian war historian. He was actually a war correspondent during the war. He would be something like a kind of more academic Ernie Pyle in terms of the kind of esteem in which he's held in Australia. And Bean says, a week ago, two of us saw some of the first units of the Great American Army training behind the American front in Lorraine. To anyone who went through the training of our 1st Division in Australia and in Egypt in 1915, it was like walking among ghosts. The same great, heavily built bodies, the same clean-shaven, keen, independent faces, the same almost over-seriousness in training for the great events which were still beyond their experience. One knows for certain that these young Americans will be equal to any officers of any army in the world. There were never two men on earth that so resembled one another as the Australian of the old 1st Division and the American of the 1st Expeditionary Force. Wonderful piece by Bean, and there's lots more like that too. So the Hindenburg line was stormed on 29 September by a combined Australian, American, British force, and then soon after, of course, with that breach, the whole Hindenburg line collapsed, and all the occupied parts of Belgium and France were reclaimed, and the armistice happened on the 11th of November. It's worth commenting that Monash, the Australian commander, that Field Marshal Montgomery in the Second World War said of Monash that had the 100 Days Offensive failed, which was led by Haig, Field Marshal Haig, had that failed, Haig would have been sacked, and most likely Monash would have replaced him as the British commander overall there. Now, people argue about that, but that was Montgomery's view anyway. I want to just finish with a couple of other slides. This is the Black Day. This is the painting of the Black Day of the German Army that I just mentioned, the 8th of August, the beginning of that. This is troops after the Battle of Hamel. Australian troops going into battle there. This is a great photograph. This is British, American, British tanks, Australian troops. You can see them up here, and then American troops all going into battle at the storming of the Hindenburg line. And of course, that's what happened. So, post-war, there are graves, Australian war graves, Commonwealth war graves, all over that part of Europe. If you go to, there's a website maintained by the Australian government that lists, I think it's in the realm of 30 or 40 different war grave areas and other. Every Australian unit has got a major memorial in that part of France and Belgium. This is really something I wanted to mention. This is just one photo of a war memorial in Australia. Every little town you visit in Australia, anywhere in Australia, will have some kind of war memorial like that, listing, chiseled on the side of it, the names of all the men who were killed from that town. And then later, the Second World War has been added, and Vietnam and so on have been added, but it was built for the First World War. Australia has more of those than any country on the Allied side. It has more than France even. Australia has 30 of those. Sorry, has one of those per 30 men killed in the First World War. France is 1 for 45. And this is just a feature of any little Australian country town that you go to. You can see these war memorials. Again, indicative of just what an impact it had on Australia. And this is not quite the ending, but this is This is, I think, one of the most sombre and evocative paintings in the great collection in the Australian War Memorial. This is Men in Gate, one of the sub battles, as it were, of the Third Ypres, and this is Men in Gate itself, which is now a memorial, and these are the ghostly men of the Australian Corps marching past it. Very sombre and evocative. Well, the end of the war, my grandfather was demobilised, but they demobilised him in the opposite order in which they went. So he went fairly late, so he didn't get demobilised till later in 1919. And he and his unit were billeted in Versailles. And this is the courtyard of Versailles, and there's my grandfather there in the courtyard of Versailles. And then many years later, there's me, my son, my daughter Arabella, and my daughter Josephine in the courtyard of Versailles in exactly the same spot that he stood. I want to conclude by I needed to get a lot of material for this, and I asked the Australian War Memorial, which actually is a museum in Canberra, to help me accumulate material. In fact, I've got a whole stack of other slides. I was getting carried away with this. And these are people, Brendan Nelson, the director, used to be a defence minister in Australia, and various of the historians. I was in Australia a few weeks ago, and I stopped in to discuss this and spent the whole morning as we did a tour of the most recently upgraded displays, all being prepared for today, the commemoration of Anzac Day in Australia, which is a massive event. The War Memorial is just a stunning building, built in the 1920s as a memorial to the First World War. The Second World War hadn't happened at this point. It is based on Byzantine architecture, deliberately picking up the theme of the Australian armed forces in the Middle East. And these are some shots of the inside, the inner dome of the big dome here, shot out into Canberra over the memorial lake there, and here's a list of all the war dead from the First World War, and people can put poppies beside them, which is what I'm wearing today, and what Laurie and my son are wearing. And it is not just an Australian symbol, but of course is a British and any of the forces who served. I don't think it's much seen here, but it's very common, and you can see that this is always red with poppies in memory of the men who fell in that horrid slaughter. So that hopefully gives you a sense of Australia's participation in the First World War, and its impact after that was profound. It was the beginning of the development of Australia as a truly independent nation. Many things socially about Australia, I think, can be explained by the experience of the First World War, and some remarkable things came out of it. I think the level of reconciliation between Australia and Turkey is I think, as Hugh Strawn also said, is one of the most remarkable reconciliations of two countries once at war that really exists. Today, just this morning, Australian Prime Minister, New Zealand Prime Minister Prince Charles, and the Turkish President Erdogan were all at Gallipoli for a service to commemorate the Gallipoli landings too, and that is an enormously well visited place by young Australians today. The various sites around the Anzac landings in Gallipoli, as are all the sites in northern France. So with that, hopefully you see that it was a little more than the Gallipoli campaign, and that the scale of Australia's involvement was very substantial. And just thank you very much, and thanks to Andrea again for his fabulous work in this whole series. Thank you. Andrea asked me if I'd take some questions. I'm happy to take questions.
I know the Turkish side of the story that you just told about Gallipoli, and I've always been curious about one thing. I mean, in the Turkish narrative, the Anzacs are usually portrayed as, unsuspecting victims of British imperialism. And, it's a major motif in this Turkish reconciliation with the Australians because, they are not the aggressors. They were tricked into that. So how does that, fit with the Australian narrative itself? And the other thing that I always wondered, there was a somehow significant Australian presence in World War II and in the Vietnam War as well. So how do the memories of World War I compare to the two others that came after? Is the World War I, more noble, more innocent than the others, perhaps? Hence the emphasis on it.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that the narrative that you described, there are certainly some Australians who hold that view. They're normally associated with a certain one end of politics, and I think it's just a somewhat kind of sloganistic, simple-minded view of the war. Of the Australian intervention. I mean, Australia had never fought in any wars. There'd been some contingent in the Boer War, and there were some casualties, and there'd been a few other minor skirmishes. So really, they were kind of naive. And the Brits obviously were more sort of experienced, but the war had only been going for a little over a year at that point, and this was seen as a way of breaking the stalemate of the Western Front. And I think that part of the narrative is absolutely right. It was, had it worked, and as you know, it was a little touch and go. It may have had profound consequences. As I understand it, you'd know better than me, but as I understand it, there was a lot of dispute in Turkey as to which side they should have joined. So it wasn't as if it was kind of unified. And had there been a demonstration of force, then maybe there would have been some kind of change in the Ottoman Empire. I remember it was the Ottoman ambassador in Paris, as I remember rightly, who argued strenuously that Turkey should do what it did in the Second World War, and they would stay neutral. But it wasn't just Australians who were slaughtered there. As I said, 34,000 Brits were killed there as well, 10,000 Frenchmen. If it was naivety right across the board, and it was just simply, I think, a complete lack of understanding of what was involved in the seaborne assault. Because remember, this isn't World War II; it's World War I. Your technology is nowhere near as good, and World War II was hard enough when it came to seaborne landings. And I think that really explains it. I think that the Australians fought under British command, but I don't think it would have been any different than under British command as they later did fight, and they were successful. But at that stage, kind of Darwinian principles were at work, and a very good general had finally emerged, at least for the Australian troops.
In the opening year or so, the British had that clever idea that everyone could sign up and you'd fight with your village or your town folk until they realized the slaughter and
Right.
you would having.
Right.
By the time the young lions from Australia got up there, had they done away with that stupid idea, or do you have small towns?
It started the same, not so much at the level of towns, because remember, you got 5 million people over that giant country. The towns weren't very big. But it was done by state. So, and I can't remember which was which, but the various divisions, the 5 divisions initially, the battalions in them had come from different states. So again, in the movie Gallipoli, that particular battalion was from Western Australia. In that, I realise I didn't answer the other part of your question. The Second World War had nowhere near the same effect. There were some episodes that are indelibly etched again on Australians' mind. The siege of Tobruk, the Battle of El Alamein, the fall of Singapore. A whole Australian division was captured in Singapore, and then were interred by the Japanese and suffered appallingly. I've forgotten how a very small number of them came back after that. Most of them had died in captivity, like so many Americans did as well. Probably the major one is the Kokoda Trail. It was the first time the Japanese had actually been stopped on ground in the appalling areas of New Guinea. It's the only. It would be the only place that would rival Gallipoli in terms of people visiting it as a spot of real significance. The Battle of the Coral Sea, which was a combined Australian-American action against the Japanese. First time they'd been stopped, they weren't beaten, but they were stopped at sea there. But Australia's role then became one of both defence and slowly taking back parts of southeast, southwest Asia there, and didn't play anywhere near the role that they played in the First World War. I mean, it was completely dominated by the Nimitz's and attack across the Pacific.
We want to thank very much President McRobbie for this wonderful speech. There is going to be some reception, so thank you.